everyone. Thank you for being here. Our message for today comes out of Romans 1:18 to 32, and it's this. The title is Bad News Before Good News, Realizing Our Need for a Savior. Okay, so bad news before good news, realizing our need for a Savior. So, who's ever had someone tell you, I have good news and I have bad news. Which one do you want to hear first? If someone says to you, which one do you pick first? Are you guys like a good news pick first person, or are you a bad news pick first person? Who's a bad news pick first? Okay, I'm usually a bad news pick. I think almost everybody is. Because it's like, I want to hear the bad news, get it out of the way, because hopefully the good news is better and makes the bad news not so bad, right? So usually, most people will pick bad news first and then tell me the good news, right? So this is exactly what Paul is doing in the book of Romans. He's like, I told you in my main point that I'm going to get to the good news. But here's the thing. If good news is going to be good news, there has to be bad news, right? And so I'm going to go to the bad news first so that you realize how good the good news is. Just to recap, we started Romans last week. Romans was written by Paul. Paul used to be really persecute Christian people, kill them, literally hunt them down and kill them, okay? That's what he used to do. But then on his way to go kill a bunch of Christians, God literally blinded him and radically changed his life, and he did a total 180. And the rest of his life, he did missions, all of his life, sharing the gospel with tons of people. Paul is the main reason why we have the Christianity today. Okay, he's a big deal. So he wrote this letter to the church in Rome, and he's telling them, I want to tell you everything about the gospel, the good news. But before I could tell you good news, I got to tell you the bad news. Because without knowing the bad news, you don't understand how truly good the good news is. Most of you, look at the person next to you, somewhere next to you, okay? Most of us, we know we're not perfect, right? Are you perfect? No one in this room is perfect, right? No one thinks they're perfect. But usually most of us think that we're good enough. I'm better than the person next to me at least, right? Look at that person, I'm at least better than them. I'm not that bad of a person. Most of us think that. But the thing is, only when you're desperate do we seek out a solution outside of ourselves. Only when everything that we can do fails do we realize that we can't save ourselves. We need help. And this whole message today, a lot of it's bad news, but the bad news is to show us that we need good news. So Paul started Romans with his main point, which I went over last week. In Romans 1:16 to 17, he says this, "For I'm not ashamed of the good news about Christ. It's the power of God at work saving everyone who believes. This good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight, and this is accomplished from start to finish by faith." So two main things I want to pull out and we're going to expand upon today. First of all, he says, to be saved. If you're saved from something, right? If you're not in a bad situation, you don't need to be saved, right? So what are we actually saved from? And here it talks about that being right in God's sight starts by faith. So if that's true, if being right in God's sight, having a right relationship with God starts with faith, then the opposite is true. If we don't have right relationship with God, or we are not right before God, it's because we don't have faith. Do you see that? So when we're right with God and we have a right relationship with him, it's because we have faith. But when we don't have a right relationship with him, when we aren't right before God, it's because we don't have faith in our lives. Now, today we're going to go into the 5 ways that we see unbelief or lack of faith happening in our lives. So the first thing is this. One of the first consequences of not having faith, of not believing God, not believing the things of God in our lives is that we experience the wrath of God. Now, the wrath of God is a concept that everyone's wrath of God, what is that? Because when we think of wrath of God, we think of anger. When you look at the next verse, Romans 1:18, it says, "But God shows his wrath from heaven against all sinful people." Now, what is the wrath of God? It is not anger. That's the closest word we have in English to describe it. But when you think of anger, you think of an angry person or human anger. But human anger is usually based off selfishness or revenge, right? Like getting revenge on someone who did wrong to you. That's not the way God's anger works. I used to think like, how could God be angry? How could God have wrath? Here's the example that I understood. God's wrath is directly connected to God's righteousness. Why? When I tell you something, like for example, when I tell you that there are 4 million young people, women, children, some men in the sex trafficking industry globally around the world, and that 1 million of those 4 million are children. Like, what do you think when you hear that? Like, nowadays we hear that so often that we're like, oh, well, it's out there. Well, the reality is, like, think of 1 million children. Think of your siblings. Think of our Sunday school kids. I just think of my child. Like, think of those kids experiencing that kind of atrocity in their lives, like being held against their will, being forced to do things that no child should ever know at that age. Like, when you hear those things, like, what happens inside to you? Like, when I hear those things, like, I'm just like it's like this anger starts to like boil up in me. Like, that's not okay. Like, that's not okay. It's not okay that those things are happening. And so I respond because it's wrong. In the same way, if I, as a broken human being, can respond like, that's wrong, and have this like righteous anger towards something like sex trafficking or like child trafficking, how much more can God, who is perfect, who knows all things, who has no ounce of sin in him, his response to wrong is going to be righteous anger too. Doesn't that make sense? If God was not righteous, he wouldn't respond in righteous anger to something that's wrong. Because God is right, he responds to wrong in that way. It's a good thing that God responds in that way because it shows that he is righteous. We follow and love a righteous God. Okay, so that's one concept. When we don't believe, when we don't live for God in faith, we can experience that. Because the next thing is that when we don't live in faith, we as human beings often suppress the truth. Look at Romans 1:18b through 19. It says this. So the same thing, God's anger, because they suppress the truth. They know the truth about God because he made it obvious to them, but they suppress the truth. How many of you, don't raise your hands, okay, I don't want to know. How many of you have ever shoplifted, okay? Or been tempted to shoplift, or actually did, okay? Don't raise your hands. But thanks, Nick. So, like, who's ever shoplifted, okay? Like, you know, especially like in the makeup. Well, nowadays the makeup aisles have like all these cameras like beaming down at you. But back when I was a kid, like, I just remember thinking like, that Great Lash Maybelline mascara, I could totally just stick that in my purse. Nobody will know, okay? But like, you know what I'm talking about? Like that thought that crosses, am I the only person that has that kind of thought? That thought that crosses your mind of like, but like deep inside you're like, but you don't do, I didn't do it because I'm like, oh, I know like someone's gonna find out. Like someone's gonna find out. So I don't do it. Like, you know deep inside that stealing is wrong, right? We all know that stealing is wrong, but we're like, oh, I should just do it anyway. So you do it, right? And you like steal something, and like a day goes by, you're like so guilty that whole day. You're like, oh my God. And someone's like, hey, I heard. You're like, what did you hear? You know, like everything freaks out. And then a day goes by, a week goes by, and you're like, no one found out. Like, Walmart's not showing up to my door, like asking where my like the makeup went. Like, it's okay. And so you do it again. You feel empowered. Like, okay, like the first time no one caught me, like I can do it again. You feel empowered to keep doing this. And you do it again and again to the point where eventually it doesn't seem wrong anymore. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, and you eventually justify it. You're like, Walmart, Target, they are multi-billion-dollar companies, okay? Me stealing this one $7 thing is not gonna make a dent in their profits. They're not gonna know. Like, we justify it. When we know at the very beginning it was wrong, but the more and more we like bend that truth, make that truth fit us, and we're like, oh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Eventually it becomes okay. It doesn't become wrong anymore. That's the idea with suppressing truth. We think that truth is plastic. We think that it's flexible, that we can mold it, that we can make it fit what we want. We are really good at doing that. But the thing is that when we decide something is right apart from God, we have totally become God ourselves. Do you see that? That process of like, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And eventually it grows. Nobody commits murder overnight, okay? Like for most people, it's led up to something. You know, like here, I guess in Colorado when I was growing up, like the biggest shocker was the Columbine high school shooting, right? That was like the biggest shocker when I was in 5th grade. And like we had to do all of these like lockdowns because for the first time there was such a huge shooting in like a nice neighborhood. And those kids, they just didn't wake up and do that one day. Like there's always a process. There's always something leading up to that. All of us experience that. But the point is to catch it at the beginning. To catch yourself, wait, I think it's okay, but like before it wasn't. Like, what am I doing? Like when we don't believe God, when we don't seek God, when we don't have faith in God, we bend the truth to fit ourselves. And when we do that, it leads to the third thing, is that we deny God in our lives. Remember, guys, we're talking about bad news today. Like we need to know the bad news about ourselves so that we realize our need for the good news. Okay, so the bad news. Verse 20. It says this, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature." A lot of people ask the question, like, how is God fair if like there's a bunch of people in the like Amazonian jungle who cannot read, they have no Bible, and how is it fair that they can die and like they don't go to heaven? Like, how does that work? How is God real? People always ask that question. Here's the thing. For most of human history, people didn't read or write. Like you and I reading and writing, that's like a modern phenomenon. Okay, most people didn't read or write most of the time. And so most people knew about God or the concept of like good and right. They talk about like ancient civilizations, like from all over the world, they all had a concept, some concept of right and wrong. Some concept of some God creating the world. They can find that in all cultures, all across the world, everywhere. And so they're saying the world itself shows like who God is. Who's ever gone to a museum? Do they have museums here? We haven't been. We've only been to like the kids' museums, like I don't know, okay? But back in California where I used to live, my husband and I used to go to a lot of museums. You know those like people on Instagram who post like a picture of them? It's like a picture of like a famous painting and they're like off to the side, like, and they just like have this like look, you know? And it's like a picture like this. And there's like some cheesy caption and you just know like 90% of people have no idea what they're looking at. Like they're acting like they're all like super artistic, but like 90% of people probably have no idea what they're looking at, okay? But some people do. But here's the thing, 100% of people who look at a painting, they don't think, oh, I wonder how the paint just like got on the canvas. Like how did that happen? They know 100% that an artist painted the painting, right? Like even if you don't know anything about art, you know that the beauty of this art is not just because it happened, it's because the artist painted the painting, right? In the same way, it's like when you look at certain art, I am not an art person, but apparently if you know art well enough, you can just look at a certain style and you know who wrote it, you know what time period it's from, you know like all these things. Because there's certain qualities that show about that artist. In the same way, when you look at our world, it reflects our Creator. It reflects everything of what He did, of how He created the world. They talk about actually the more deeper you go into science, the deeper you go into science, like the more and more you realize you can't deny that there's some kind of being. There's something that like helped these things get into motion. And so it's talking about like all of the world knows that there is a God of some sort. But verse 21, it says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And so they began to think foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. This is the most fascinating verse to me, because this is the concept. The problem is not that human beings don't know that there is a God. The problem is they know there is a God, but they do not want to worship him. They do not want to glorify him as God. They're like, oh, I know a God exists, but he's not God of my life. That's the idea. That's what happens when we don't have faith. When we're like, I know God's real, but like I don't know if I can make him my God. Guys, that's literally like showing us that we're living out that bad news. Like we are doing this. We are living in unbelief. Another really important concept here is the idea of giving thanks. Did you guys know that giving thanks like literally combats when you're like, oh, I have so much doubt, I don't like know if God is there. But when you give thanks, you actually combat that in your life. This is how powerful giving thanks is. Do you know why? Because when you give thanks, when you explicitly are like, not like, oh God, thank you for this food. Well, that's true, you should do that. But you know what I mean? Like not just like in your mind, like it's in emotions, but when you truly are like, God, thank you for my family, whatever it is. Thank you for this and that. Like when you truly explicitly give thanks to God, you are acknowledging that God is the giver of all of these good things. Do you understand that? That's the power of giving thanks in your life. When you give thanks, you acknowledge that God is the one who gave you these things. Whenever I give my child a present nowadays, because now he's smart enough to like know like it's a present and like who gave it to him, and I never give him stuff and tell him it's like, I always tell him it's for me. Like I always tell him it's for me. Like it might be a hand-me-down toy from Ethan. We got a bunch of those. And I'll tell him like, oh, this is from Ethan Hyunga, okay? But like some of them I'm like, oh, it's from Oma. Which is true because I could have thrown it away, but I didn't, okay? And I'm like, oh, this is from Oma. Or like JD Stanley gave us a bunch of toys and I was like, this is from JD Nuna, but actually Oma gave it to you, okay? Like Oma's the one that made the choice not to throw this away and give this to you, okay? So who gave this to you? I always like drill him. I'm like, he's like, Oma. I'm like, exactly. Oma 너무 좋아하지? Like Oma's the best, right? My husband's like, you are brainwashing that child. I'm like, my window to brainwash is real short. Like it's gonna go away soon, so I gotta do it now. So I'll always tell him like, this toy, these things will fade away, right? But the heart of who gave it to you, that's what counts. Who loves to give gifts? There are certain people who love to give gifts. I have a friend who like loves to give gifts. That kind of friend is really hard to give a gift to because she's so good at giving gifts. Like she'll literally go to any place and she'll find like the most perfect gift for that person whose birthday is like 8 months later. But she'll buy it and save it for that person. And like when they get it, like she like lives for that reaction. Like that's her joy in life, is to see people react to their presents. But that's how it is with God. Like everything God's given us, he's like, I give it to you and I give it to you freely, but I give it to you so that you could also know who I am. You could understand the heart of the gift giver, not just the gift itself. God is not as manipulative or brainwashing as I am with my son. However, that is the point of God is saying, I give you these things so that you can know who I am. You can know who I am. Guys, so quick summary. When we don't believe God, even if it's an aspect of God, when we doubt things about God, which all of us have those doubts, but if we don't check those doubts early on, if you don't like check those things and bring it into like right place, if we just let those doubts go, if you let those doubts just take root in your heart, this is how it spirals. We first suppress truth, we bend truth to fit us. And when we do that, we deny God. And when we deny God, what does that lead to? If that goes unchecked, like a snowball effect, what that leads to is self-worship. We worship the created instead of the creator. Look at verse 23, it says this. Instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols. Guys, idols are not statues for us nowadays. Idolatry is trying to fix our broken hearts and finding our identity and worth in anything other than God. It could even be good things. It could even be ministry. A lot of pastors, they talk about how their church has become their idol. Like your family becomes your idol. Like those things can totally happen if we put that in the wrong order in our lives. Guys, The very core of human beings, like the problem with human beings, is that every evil that's ever committed is a love of self. Love of something for myself. I love myself more, so I end up hurting that person. But that person doesn't matter, because as long as I get what I want, it's okay. The heart of our rebellion against God is that we replace God with other things that are not God. This is why Paul's message of the gospel is so powerful. Guys, no other religion tells you that you just have to believe and it's okay. You don't have to do anything. Every other religion is works-based. You have to do something, be good enough. But can you and I ever be good enough every single day of our lives? The power of Jesus and the good news, it's so powerful. It's because it tells you, you cannot be God. You and I cannot be God. You and I cannot be right on our own. We need a new heart from the inside out. You know, one thing I really hate, when I got married, I told my husband, I will do anything, but I really, really hate cleaning the bathroom. So I just want you to understand, like, if the bathroom is dirty for a long, long time, you're gonna have to clean it. Like, that's what I always told him, okay? And like, I do clean the bathroom, but it's not one of my favorite things to do. I love laundry, I love other things, but I just don't love cleaning the bathroom. And so he can always tell when I've cleaned it though, because I just clean like enough to where it looks clean. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it looks clean enough. But like, people who are really good at cleaning the bathroom, like, they full on like detonate the place. Like, they full on like Clorox, like spray, like everything. Like, that's what you should do, okay? Everyone's like, I did not want to go pee in your bathroom. Like, it's okay, my husband cleans it. But like, I just like, that's good enough, you know? Like, I just clean the outside. But really, that's not clean, right? Like, it's not clean. Like, you don't want to lick my toilet. Like, it's not a good idea, right? It's gross. But like, we just try to clean the outside. But Christianity tells us, like, you need a rebirth. You need a new heart, a new mind, a new character. You need everything. You need to press reset, delete, and reset on your programming and just start all over again. And the only way we can do that is by God doing that in us when we allow him. That's why faith and belief are so tied to the gospel. Because instead of putting your faith in yourself and your ability to figure it out, you are now putting your faith in Jesus, in the one who can make that change in you, that only he can make that change. You can't make that change. That's why the gospel is so radical. It's so upside down. It's so transformative, because it's all about who you are, not just what you do. So when human beings fall into self-worship, into falling into worship the created ones, whether it's yourself or someone else, or we worship created things and we don't worship the creator, what happens if we let that go? The last thing is that we literally self-destruct. Romans 1:24, it says this, so God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. When we see the word abandon, it has a negative connotation. In a lot of translations, it says this, God gave them up, or God gave them over to their sin. This concept is repeated 3 times in this passage. As kids, who's ever begged their parents for something that your parents at first are like, no. But you keep begging. Like, you beg and you beg and you beg and you beg so much, and finally they're like, fine. And you're like, yes! Like, as a child, you're like, I made it. Like, I did it. And sometimes that's fine, you know, obviously, like, but if you were like begging your parents to do something really dangerous, like, that wouldn't be a good idea, right? Like, as a parent, now I understand. Like, my child's gotten very persuasive now, and like, he will ask and ask and ask and ask and ask until he wears me down to the bone, and then I just say yes. But oftentimes, just because your parents say yes to you doesn't mean it was the best thing for you, okay? Like, that's the same thing with God. Like, he's like, if you're just gonna keep going in that direction, okay, I'm gonna let you go and do that. It's like the prodigal son. Like the prodigal son story in Luke, where it talks about the younger son. He's like, give me the inheritance, Dad. So like, it's like you going to your parents right now and being like, before you die, can you give me all your money? Like, I don't care if you live or die. Like, I just want your money. So, like, just give me the money, my inheritance. I'm peace out. If that was like any other dad, they'd be like, they'd be like, what are you doing? But that dad was like, okay, if that's what you want, I will let you go. But that was actually so much worse of a consequence because he left, wasted all the money within days and months, and then he was suffering, and like, he suffered so much for his consequences. But that made him realize, like, oh my gosh, why am I doing this? Sometimes God lets us go. Y'all, that doesn't mean you won the argument. That's the scariest thing when God lets you go. When God's like, okay, you do what you want. That's okay. I will be here when you come back, but I'm going to let you go. I'm going to let you face the consequences of your actions. That is the scariest thing, guys, when God lets us do that. We think like, oh, we can do all these things. It's all good. And then when like stuff goes down, you're like, dude, that was God's fault. No, he let you go and you made those choices and now you're paying for it. Guys, that's what happens when God lets us just go. Imagine if we lived in a society where you could do whatever you wanted, no consequences. You could say whatever you want, no consequences. You can do whatever you want. You could be whoever you want, no consequences. But do we live in a world like that? No. There's always a domino effect. Actually, if we live like this, Paul spends the rest of the book listing out 22 different examples of what happens to us when God lets us go. It's a long list, and it's very wide range, from things like greed, envy, gossip, backstabbing, pride, homosexuality, disobeying parents, breaking promises. He gives a huge list to show us, not these specific things that you do wrong, but there's a huge range of ways that when he lets us go, we fall into our own trap. You know, when you have an apple tree, what fruit do you expect? Apples. Okay, that's not very hard, right? You don't expect oranges from an apple tree. Like, the fruit will show you what tree it is. All of those things he's talking about, greed, pride, all those things, those are just fruit. But the root issue deep down is that we have changed places with God. That instead of God being God and worshiping God as the creator, we have worshiped the created things instead. So what does this mean for you and I today? As Korean Americans, most of in this room are Korean Americans, we are part of a shame and honor culture. A lot of cultures are too, part of a shame and honor culture. We don't want anyone to know we have issues or problems. We always have it together. We're okay. But sometimes I think we have ignored our problems. We have done the fake it till you make it for so long, we've literally fooled ourselves into thinking that we're okay when we are not. Do y'all hear me? Like, we have bought into this, like, we're okay, I'm okay, to the point where you believe that. We are so out of touch with our own bad news that we don't feel a need for good news. We are so out of touch with our own brokenness and our own self-destruction that we don't feel like we need a savior. We don't feel like we need Jesus. Can I even start reading? Here's the thing, guys. Like, what today resonated with you? What today resonated with you? Maybe it's that we suppress the truth more than we realize, trying to make the truth fit into our box, our way of understanding, instead of trying to fit ourselves into God's truth. Maybe we deny God. Maybe that sounds harsh, but maybe by not acknowledging God in our lives, by not giving thanks to Him, we're actually denying God's work in our lives. Maybe you put more faith in yourself, in your power to fix your life. Maybe the greatest hindrance in you growing closer to God is your own self. Oftentimes that's the case for me. It's not that God is far away, or I can't hear God, or God's not real, or God doesn't do these things. No, He's always doing those things. It's me that holds myself back oftentimes. Maybe you've been playing musical chairs with God for too long. You've taken His seat and you put Him in yours. You're the God of your own life more than He is. Or maybe we're seeing the consequences of our actions. We've fallen away into self-destruction and we blame it on God. But maybe, just maybe, you've gotten yourself there. I don't know what it is. But the power of the gospel is in the fact that you and I cannot save ourselves. We cannot save ourselves. Only God can. But the good news can only truly be good news to you when you realize you need it. When you realize the bad news in your own heart first. When you realize, I need God. Like, I literally cannot breathe and live my day. I can't be human and function well in society. I can't make decisions. I can't do things if I don't know God for myself. Can we stand all together and pray for a few minutes together? I don't know what from today stuck out to you. I have no idea. But I do know that all of us need to be reminded of this, that we need to know the bad news of our hearts. We need to know why we need God. If you don't realize that, you don't need God. Can we spend a few minutes praying together, just on your own, praying and saying, hey God, I think I'm not thanking you enough. I think I've tried to fit you into my truth, but I haven't tried to fit into your truth. Or whatever it may be that resonated with your heart today. Can we spend a few minutes before God with that?